is the great quest, the holy obsession, the vision of my life to have Christ formed in me? Is this, regardless of what I do for God or how I serve God or where I live or what my job is or whatever, is the burning inner quest of my life, form the Son of God in me, form the image of Jesus in me?
Jon, thanks for coming on. It is always great to see you. You are one of my dear friends, and I don't know if we can say partner quite yet, but collaborator on a regular basis in kingdom stuff. And my love for you and respect for you is very, very deep. So thanks for being with us today. Hope you're doing well. Are you in New York right now?
I am, mate, and it is always great to chat with you. Those feelings are mutual, and looking forward to talking about things that really matter.
100%. So I quote you in my book a few times in part 3, which is on the world. I quote your book, Beautiful Resistance. And really just the title alone is worth the price of admission, because that's your kind of moniker, your name for the church at an aspirational level, what the church has the potential to become. And so, I write about kind of church as a counter practice, and often we don't think of church as a practice or a spiritual discipline, but it very much is. It is a habit. It is something that we do with our body and our mind and our relational world, and we set before God for Him to do what only He can in us and through us. And, in biblical theology, a church is like a contrast community to the world, thinking there of the language of our mutual friend Tim Mackey from the Bible Project, this kind of contrast between what is and what could be. So talk to us about what's behind, why did you choose that title, and what's the kind of operating motif behind that book?
Well, I actually was trying to figure out how Bonhoeffer, which is basically where the big idea comes from, how Bonhoeffer, a committed pacifist, is executed for his participation in a plot to kill Hitler. I was so wrestling with my pacifist leanings and just war theory. I was like, what happened in Bonhoeffer that made him sort of do this? And so I'd read quite a bit of stuff, but there was a new biography that had come out called A Strange Glory by Charles Marsh. And when I was reading that, I actually got sidetracked away from my great question about Bonhoeffer and pacifism into Bonhoeffer's vision of counterformation. That's what gripped me out of this book. And there's a scene where Bonhoeffer is invited to help build the underground church, which is a resistance movement against the complicity of the Protestant and Catholic Church to the Third Reich. And so he's given this building and a piece of land with which to host his little pastor's training school. It all looks very, very humble. But it is, when you read about it, it's a very, very intense common life. And so this is where he was modeling the book Life Together. This is where Cost of Discipleship came from. And one of his friends who'd heard him lecture, and by the way, Bonhoeffer was a genius. I don't use that term lightly. Karl Barth called his doctoral dissertation that he wrote at age 21 a theological miracle. And he just had a staggering mind. But one of the things I loved about Bonhoeffer, it wasn't intellect. He was committed to embodying the way of Jesus.
Yeah.
So one of his friends who had heard him lecture earlier sort of was getting some intel that Bonhoeffer had set up a community, a pastor's training community, and it was too intense. And he was sort of...
And this was basically like an underground seminary, right?
Yeah, yes. It was it wasn't very large, couple dozen pastors, and it was out in the middle of nowhere, and it wouldn't have looked like anything. Beautiful Resistance opens by me standing on the ground where that happened. I went there. Right. It's now in Poland to go see where this happened. But one of his friends basically is like, this is too intense. So he comes out to spend some time with Bonhoeffer to basically talk him out of so much spiritualism. Like, sort of calm down. So,
and Bonhoeffer comes from like an upper class family, right? He's a professor, and it's like, come back to your senses. You've abandoned your career, all of marriage, all of the things.
What is this? What is this spiritual zeal? It's unbecoming for an elite to have so much sort of, just raw energy for something. Just like, get your gentile senses back. So Bonhoeffer takes him in a boat. They row across the Oder Sound to an airfield where Hitler is training his troops. So there's planes taking off and landing, and there's troops marching in formation, and they walk up onto this hill. And Bonhoeffer basically launches into a speech to his friend about what is happening to the church. And he talks about how the church has been co-opted. He talks about the discipline of the Third Reich to form people. And he basically makes a comment pointing to Finkenwald, which is where he's got his training school. This what I'm doing, this thing that I'm forming, this community of people, this has to be stronger than this, pointing at Hitler's formation process of training soldiers for the Third Reich. And he talks about the need to produce a harder, stronger kind of person with a stronger formation than that of the Third Reich. And so you've got this prophet on a hill contrasting his vision of discipleship with Hitler's vision of forming people into soldiers for a great war. And his basic line is, this must be stronger than that. We must form people more strongly than Hitler is trying to form people. And they get back in their boat, and it says they row back in silence. And I've always loved that image, because a lot of times I think when you and I talk about discipleship, we talk about spiritual formation, we talk about mission, I often get people kind of pushing me to calm down a little bit. And I don't think people understand the stakes and the time of history that we live in how urgent it is that our formation, again, has to be stronger than the formation of the world. So that was the vision of Beautiful Resistance. And then in some ways, it's a book complementary to yours. It's basically trying to ask the question, what is the world doing in terms of shaping us? And then how do we resist it? Not with sort of like a militant defensiveness, but with a gracious, compelling beauty. And so I try and contrast those things in the book.
Yeah, whenever I teach on formation, at the beginning, I always say, spiritual formation is not a Christian thing or a religious thing. It's a human thing. We're all being formed. We're all becoming a person. We're all indexing in a certain direction, trending in a certain direction, for better or for worse. And two, all Christian spiritual formation is counter-formation to that of, in my paradigm, the world, the flesh, and the devil. We're already being formed by the world. And so I think that's a great mistake that Christians often make when they approach formation or discipleship or whatever you want to call it, is, like we're a whiteboard or a blank slab of clay that, Jesus is just going to form us. No, we've already been deformed by other cultural currents. So talk to us about that. Would you agree with that, disagree with that in your pastoral experience as people come into your church? You're in New York, there's a high turnover rate just because of the city, people coming in and out of the city every few years. What's your pastoral, and from all over the world, what's your pastoral experience as far as formation and counter-formation?
No, I definitely think that's it. One of the great things that woke me up as a Christian, so here was my paradigm. Why would you want to be a Christian? Those people are slaves to the church. I can be free and autonomous in the world. And one of the things God showed me that made me leave my basically teenage hedonism was like, you're not free in the world. You're actually a slave to the world. And Jesus has come to actually set you free. I had like a completely false understanding of reality. And when I realized that Jesus came to set me free from the deformation of the world and change me into the person I was like born by God to become, it was a source of liberation and joy. Now, this happened in a Pentecostal environment, so it was like pretty dramatic, a lot of wow and a lot of sizzle. And it did take me, 27 years plus to sort of realize, I was more formed by that system of the world than I even know. I was up this morning meditating, just realizing how far I still have to walk down the way of the cross. How much in my inner man is still formed by the things of the world. It's quite remarkable. So yeah, I had a personal awareness of that has definitely informed my pastoring. New York, sociologists have shown that if you live in New York, you end up walking faster. It is one of the fastest walking cities in the world. Your physical pace of walking changes when tourists are dropped into Manhattan. So my question is like, if your pace of walking changes subconsciously, What else do you think is changing subconsciously? Well, I'm telling you everything. The story of your life, your sense of self, meaning, values, joy, the enemy, all of these things are like being radically reframed wherever we go. And I think it is very, very true that we are dominated by explicit ideologies that are at war with the Christian vision of life, and they are forming us. There's formation happening on the level of narrative. There's formation happening on the level of personal story. There's formation happening on the level of identity, what it means to be human. And then we are radically enculturated, piece by piece, step by step. All of us, in some sense, are like Breaking Bad, moving slowly down a pathway towards destruction in the world, never consciously thinking we're going to end up there, but these small series of steps take us places we never thought we'd go. And a lot of times I see that in pastoring in New York. So if you think about Romans 12, I think you imagine being a follower of Jesus and being in a house church and then walking through a part of the city of Rome. I've spent quite a bit of time in Rome, and imagine this moment, walking from a villa to another community where people are reading this letter. And you've walked through the city of Rome and you're walking past the theater where pagan stories are told. You're walking past brothels, you're walking past temples, you're walking past Roman ideology and narrative, Pax Romana propaganda. You're walking past the cult of the emperor. And you're walking past all of that, and then you sit in a room, and then you have to try and ask the question, okay, if I'm not going to be conformed by the world, what is the world? What is Rome? And how is its religion, practices, values, habits, hobbies, taboos? How has all of that shaped me? And how does Jesus want to reshape me? I think where the church goes wrong, and this is what you see a lot, is that we are very aware of one kind of enculturation and ideology, but we're completely blind to the other one. So, for example, people who are deeply concerned about critical theory or neo-Marxism are often completely unaware to the ways that they are radically spiritually deformed by America, excessive consumption, hyper-nationalism. So, yeah, we're formed, and one of the most dangerous ways the world forms us is that it forms partial blind spots and partial things of truth where we just can't see properly. So the church then, as you mentioned, has to be fundamental to its purpose, radically counterformative. And that's why churches that simply mimic the practices of the world, the values of the world, fail in their fundamental task, which is to help people become like Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, it's do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed. So there's that, you've already been deformed, right? So
Yes.
now it's counterformation. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So, I mean, you mentioned ideology. Both of us live in cities. I think anywhere you live, just in our cities, the ideology are so in your face. You know what I mean? It's just like literally in every other storefront window. And, Willard defined ideas, the kind of root of ideology, as assumptions about reality. Not as reality. Reality is what is. Ideas are our assumptions about reality. And the wonder of the human mind is we can hold ideas that are true and we can hold ideas that are wildly untrue. And that's the danger, don't you think, that often the ideologies, the worldview that we live into, that we even view the world through, it's just these unchecked assumptions. I mean, part of why I think both of us wrote our books, I'm interpreting my own heart in yours, was to attempt to kind of expose so many of the secular narratives on the left and on the right that are just kind of assumptions for people that are actually deforming them, one day at a time. So what advice do you have for somebody, whether they are living in middle America or somewhere else in the world, and in particular if they're living in a New York or a Portland or an LA our cities are formation machines. What advice do you have somebody, these cities, and now the internet, so even if you're just sit at home in your bedroom, these are formation machines. The internet and our context, our city, our town are forming us. Like, what advice do you have to a Christian in a place like this whose heart is be transformed by the renewing of your mind?
Well, I think I don't want to say it's a 4-step process, but I think there's 4 distinctives you have to keep in mind. Paul says to the Galatians, and the Galatians experienced the radical power of the gospel and the supernatural. So this is like a charismatic, this is a Word and Spirit church when it was born. But he says, like, who has bewitched you? Like, who cut in on you? And so his response when they are, basically experiencing like heretical theology going back into legalism, he says, like, I'm in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. So number one, we have to realize the great apostolic vision and mission was the formation of Christ in the hearts of God's people. And we talk about that a lot, but I really, like, this is what struck me so much this morning, is the great quest, the holy obsession, the vision of my life to have Christ formed in me. Is this, regardless of what I do for God or how I serve God or where I live or what my job is or whatever, is the burning inner quest of my life, form the Son of God in me, form the image of Jesus in me. And so that requires an awareness of who Jesus is, an awareness of the character of Jesus. And that has to be a great burning vision, is I want union with Christ. I want the image of Jesus to be formed in me. Then I think you hit it. Then you have to realize I have to go through a season of counter-formation, which is I have to identify all the deformation that has happened to me. So what are the lies I've believed? You should not live those lies. What am I living?
I'll Venmo you later. Thank you.
Yes, what am I living? Like, how is this snuck in? And so, it's the renewing of the mind. It's the transformation of our habits. It's the renewal of the imagination. It's the widening of the horizon of possibility. It's all of those things. And so we get an awareness of our places of deformation. Then we have to have that vision of transformation. And to me, this is why I am definitely a contemplative charismatic. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3 that with unveiled faces, which talks about the beauty of the new covenant, we can contemplate the Lord's glory.
Yeah, that's where the language of contemplative practice comes from, right there.
Yeah, and we're being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. So there's like your contemplative, transformative, Spirit-empowered vision. So a big part of the transformation that I don't think we spend enough time really talking about is getting out wide, is beholding the glory of Jesus. Like really asking, what is the kingdom of God? Who is this beautiful King? And contemplating that. And that is a big part of our transformation. That then leads us to the last stage, which is consciously conformation. It's being conformed to the image of the Son. And this is our destiny. We've been predestined to be conformed to the image of the Son. So number one, you got to have that vision of formation. Number two, be aware of where you need to be, where you've been deformed. Get a vision and practice of transformation. And then the goal of that is conformation into the image of Jesus. So to me, it's being in a community that values this. Like, we have talked a lot about, like hype church doesn't do the job. Life has gotten too hard for hype to be spiritually effective. And it doesn't change who we are. It doesn't speak to the kinds of people that Jesus is wanting to form us into. So it's a vision of Jesus. It's an awareness of the ways we've been deformed. It's counter-formative practices that push us and move us and reshape us into different directions. It's in a community where Jesus is lifted up and beheld in all of his glory. And then I think that community is on a journey to live in the kingdom of God. And so those kingdom practices provide the guardrails of common life, which resist the way of the world. And so, I would just simply ask people, because a lot of times there's so much Christian activism and there's so much Christian experience chasing, like the Desert Fathers talked about spiritual greed for magnificent experiences rather than just a humble passion for Christ himself. So make sure the church is centered on Christ, that you're in a community that is actually practicing the way of Jesus, and that is providing you the fuel to be able to move out in the world on mission with these practices of resistance. I think all of that in your mind, and you're looking for that and you're living into that, is a lot better than just, quote, finding a church I like.
Yeah, that's gold. I want to drop down here for a minute, and I'm 100% with you on the, I think a gracious interpretation would be that in a previous era when the cultural architecture of the wider world was a little bit more Christianized, the main problem was kind of like apathy in the church. And how do you kind of wake up the church from a kind of spiritual slumber to pursue Jesus? That's no longer the moment that most of us are living in. It's like Daniel in Babylon. You know what I mean? It's like a furnace of formation. How do we not bow the knee? And that calls for that calls for a different kind of posture. So just two follow-up questions that I'm hearing in my mind for people who are listening. One, what would you say to somebody? It's sad in my mind as somebody who is very much in the formation world, like that's my driving passion, what I'm giving the next kind of chunk of my work life to, but how it's often co-opted by radical individualism, and how often, people that will take formation seriously almost do it at the expense of becoming a part of a local church rather than woven into the fabric of a local church. So what would you say to somebody who would be 100% with you, counter-formation, contemplative practice, counter habits to the way of the world, but they would say, why do I need to be a part of a church? I live in wherever, and there's not a, Jon Tyson isn't, preaching down the street, and, my church doesn't even talk about the way of Jesus or whatever. Why do I need to be a part of a community? Why can't I just do this with myself and my spiritual director or some good books and podcasts?
Well, I think when you ask the question, who is Jesus? Into whose image are you being formed? Okay. Jesus' life was given for others. The Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for others. And a community of love requires other people to be a part of it. By this will all men know that you are really my disciples, by the quality of your love, not the quality of your counter practices. And if those practices are only turning you inwards into sort of self-reflection and not outwards in self-sacrifice, you're not living the way of Jesus. You're doing life hacks. And they may be like good antidotes to some of the brokenness of modern life, but that's a different thing than becoming like Christ. Look at, like behold the Son of God washing feet. Behold the Son of God forgiving enemies. Behold the Son of God's patience with his disciples, drawing them aside, instructing them, teaching them, and training them. Behold the Son of God concerned to leave the 99 to find the one. Like that Jesus' life was lived for others, and true spiritual formation will always drive us beyond the self into the heart of the church. Otherwise, it's just like renewing project self, and it's not the kingdom of God. Now, I do want to acknowledge that some people may actually need a disproportionate season of like time alone and thoughtfulness, but I still think like if that season becomes your lifestyle, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
Because, Jesus had that rhythm. He would withdraw to be with the Father, and then he'd come and pour himself out. And he often withdrew, but most of the Gospels are him engaging. And in fact, we barely even know what happens when he withdraws. We're just told he does it. And then we get little glimpses like the Father saying, listen to my son, I love him. Like it's basically going in for divine union and affirmation and coming out to serve the world. And I think that's the rhythm of following Jesus, not just project self.
Yeah, we both read, because you did a series on this recently, Cornelius Plantinga, and I quote him in my book on sin. Some of his writing on sin was just, I found it extraordinary.
So good.
But his idea, how do you read a book entirely on sin? The whole book is on sin, and it was a page turner, and something we can all relate to. But his idea of sin, and this is a more ancient Christian idea, as opposed to the kind of Reformation view of sin as like the transgression of law, this kind of judicial view of sin. The more ancient, and still Eastern Orthodox view of sin is it's like a disease that has infected your heart and your whole body that is literally killing you. The result of it is death. The wages of sin is death. It doesn't say that God kills sinners. It says that sin kills sinners, It pays in death. And, if the root of, so it's like this cancer, it's like this infectious disease that everything we touch, we infect, even if our heart is to help and to heal. And if the root of human sin is at some level self-will, the will, I think Augustine said this, turned in on itself, the will that
Yes,
was designed to,
yes.
open and surrender and yield to the love and the wisdom of God through union with the Father and the Son and the Spirit. That will is then closed off to the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and turned in on itself. And we become, you shall be like gods. We become the self becomes the new God, the new center of the universe, the new locus point of authority. If that's the root of human sin, and if sin corrupts everything it touches, then that's going to come into even our own spiritual formation, our own discipleship practices, our own prayer life, and it's so easily going to be co-opted by this bent part of our heart. And I don't mean that in some heavy, I actually have a very robust view of human goodness and the Imago Dei. Just in a self-awareness, this can corrupt even our life with God, even our prayer life. Robert Mulholland, who I love his little book on Invitation to a Journey, kind of the best all-in-one place book I know in formation. And he opens by just going off about how spiritual formation is being formed into the image of Christ for the sake of others.
Yes.
And he just goes off about for the sake of others, not for you. This is not like Christian Buddhism where you just have some tips and techniques to become a nicer, happier person, though that's really good, and I'm not against any of that. A lot of Christians need to become nicer, happier persons. But this is about how you take up your cross and how you discover life on the other side of death, So that's what I'm hearing you say. I get asked a lot, what are your fears with spiritual formation? And when people start to take it seriously, most people assume I will say legalism, because that's a major problem. Because practices, for example, I do a lot of teaching on the practices of the spiritual disciplines. They're all means to an end. None of them are the end. The goal of Sabbath is not to Sabbath. The goal of Scripture is not to read Scripture. The goal of prayer is not even to pray. It's all theosis and union. It's to become like God and with God. But that's actually not my major fear. I think just generationally, and maybe this is just being located in Portland, if there's a spectrum with legalism on one side and hedonism on the other, the culture is so far toward hedonism that any movement toward the other direction feels like a healthy counterbalance. My main fear is radical individualism and project self, that formation will just become a Christianized version of kind of project self. How do I get myself a little nicer, a little happier, a little less anxious? All of which are good things, but none of which I think lead us into the life of the kingdom.
It's such a temptation. I think maybe legalism in other generations. I mean, you just think about the generation coming out of World War II. Okay, coming out of World War II, they were the great generation, the greatest generation. They gave themselves for country, for neighbor. Young men weeping because they were turned away because they weren't admitted to the military. That deep sense of shame of not being able to sacrifice your life for others. And, David Brooks writes about this. And then you look at, and then what came next was the me generation. The counterculture movement in many ways was about, self-actualization, not cultural identity or servanthood. And I only reference that point is because we're now sort of 70-ish years fueled by staggeringly effective technology to focus everything on the self.
Yeah,
and so we're so far into that. There's not even another way of thinking culturally. You just can't even reach back to your parents and ask them, was there another way to live? It's like so much of it is oriented towards the self. So yeah, we will default to that, and other generations may have defaulted to legalism, but we certainly are not. I think we are defaulting into how do I use this for me?
Yes. And of course, there are personalities that are still wired that way, but they are very much a small minority in my pastoral experience. Small, low single digits, And that doesn't mean they're not important. It means the overall message, I think, is take up your cross.
Yeah, it's very simple. If Christianity is defined by love, love requires others. Yeah. It's like, so if your practices are not pushing you to others, they're not pushing you to love. And so love requires other people, and the church, we have to be around. And honestly, I can tend to, I was talking to our church on Sunday about the danger of church driven by preferences. Here's the preaching I like. Here's the worship I like. Here's the community groups I like. All you will do is overlook. You will build massive deficiencies in your life with God. And, because you'll make the assumption that your preferences are God's preferences. And so anything I like is going to form me into the kind of person that God is like. And it's like, no, that's why you need to be around annoying people and receive them as a genuine gift. Oh, these people are reminding me that I have set the center around my preferences. This is why you need to be around the poor. The poor are a gift to us because they have a different view of reality, and they have gifts to bring us that are often overlooked in all of our affluence and our luxury. And so if the goal is formation and you ask, how am I formed? Most of the ways that we're really formed is relationally, and getting around us brings us out of ourselves and into the life of others.
Yeah, I mean, this is a Trinitarian theology. The best, why is God Trinity? Because God is love, and love cannot exist outside of relationship. And we're made in this image. We cannot exist outside of this relationship. Okay, second follow-up question for somebody listening, and then we'll move on, is what advice do you have, just not to put you on the spot, but walk us through a morning or a day in the contemplative life of Jon Tyson in New York City. Like, teach us to pray, I guess is the question here. Any thoughts you have? And, you're Jon Tyson, so everything you do is turned up to 11. It's the beauty of who you are.
It's not true.
But, walk us through, what does contemplative prayer, what was life with God? What does, you mentioned, the old idea of beholding and becoming, that beautiful vision from Corinthians 2. What does that look like for you in your ordinary day?
Everyone's different. I shared this with your congregation, I think, at some point during the pandemic. I think our church has 3 pillars. We could tangible presence, counter-formation, sacrificial mission. That's the 3 things our church is built on. And I think in some sense, it's the Venn diagram of those things that is the kind of disciple we're trying to produce. So my day is built around those things. It's built around enjoying the presence of God. So I spend my mornings, I set my alarm, I get up early. If you're not a morning person, don't worry about it. Do what works for you, but this is my life. I get up early. I do 2 things with that time. I read great devotional literature. I just read for the heart. I love charts, but if there's a chart in this book, I don't want to see it. I just want to read for the heart. I want to learn from the mystics. I want to learn from the saints. I want to learn from the mission. I want to learn with people who've walked with God. And I try and take that in my spirit and just receive it with joy. And then I basically do like a Lectio Divina. I call it how to spend time with God. Truth, insight, mission, encounter. It's just like basically read, think, pray, live. And I read the lectionary. I got into that a while back, and just have some sort of Bible reading plan. Doesn't matter what it is. I've done Bible in a year. I did that for a decade. Then I slipped back into the lectionary because I missed parts of the scriptures. So I'll meditate slowly through it, and I'll look for something to stand out. I'm reading in the Gospels this morning, and it said, Jesus saw their faith and said to the man, your sins are forgiven. I was like, Jesus saw their faith. How can he see faith? Jesus, so this is not faithfulness. This is conscious belief in the possibility of God to act. Do you see faith in me? Lord, increase my faith. I mean, that is a door into contemplation, wonder, hunger, prayer. So I spent, probably 20 minutes sitting there with coffee in my hand saying, Lord, increase my faith. I love you. Help me to love you more. I believe in you. Help me to believe in you more. I trust you. Increase my trust in you. And then I'll just sort of like journal about it. And then that's my morning. And I'm literally trying to enjoy God. I'm trying to enjoy his presence so that no matter what else happens during the day, I have peace in my heart to draw from, to center my spirit on the living God. Then during the day, I'm basically trying to interact with God, sort of like the vineyard, where is the Father moving? The only way not to be overwhelmed by the need of the world is to find what God's asking you to do about the world. What's he asking you to do? And so I'm always trying to discern, Lord, do you want me to step out? Do you want me to speak? Do you want me to be silent? Do you want me to give a prophetic word? Do you want me to speak to a stranger? I'm just trying to be present with God and ask, what are you doing? And, one of my mentors always had this phrase. He said, whenever I step into a room, I ask this question: where have you been working in advance to extend your kingdom? You've been working in advance. How do I step into that?
That is a
So it's
great
quite,
question.
yeah, it makes days exciting. I mean, yesterday I had a moment of just glory and divine encounter by the handing of an umbrella. It seems so small, and nobody on planet Earth would have recognized it but me and the other person, but it was a moment of the kingdom. And I was like, gosh, to have a life filled with these kingdom moments, that's what I'm wanting to do. So sometimes there's spiritual warfare. I have to resist. Sometimes there's boldness. I have to act, but I'm trying to ask, where is God working and how do I join him? And then at night, I am a little bit of an old school Pentecostal. I grew up in a binding and loosing environment. And
Yes.
so I believe that God answers our prayer. I mean, Jesus says, he told them this parable that they should always pray and never give up. There's something about contending prayer, persevering prayer. I have a prayer list. I have prophetic words. I have promises. I have longings. I have, and I'm trying to ask that these things happen. I am praying that that he would lead me not into temptation and he would deliver me from evil. All I have and all I am delivered from the evil one. I'm praying for the advance of the kingdom. I read this amazing book called Calling on the Name of the Lord. It was a biblical theology of prayer. And he says, biblical prayer is this: it's calling on the name of the Lord to fulfill his promises. That's it. That's what prayer is. It's mediated in the new covenant. It's calling on the name of the Lord through Jesus for the Father's promises. But it's still like we are asking God to do what God has said he wants to do. And he loves when we remind him and call on those things. So that's like, I basically have three movements of prayer. One would be described as contemplative. One would be described as sort of charismatic. I'm looking for the activity and gifts of the Spirit. And then one would be described as sort of like contending. It is really crying out in intercession. So I made a, I don't want to call it a deal. Like I'm always asked, and I think deep in my spirit, I'm a revivalist at heart. There's something in me that longs for just, breakthrough encounters with God. But it's like, what can you do to facilitate that? We can't whip it up. But there is an invitation in the book of Hosea which says, break up the fallow ground. And so I've made like sort of a covenant with God that I will give God the majority of my media consumption and I will replace it with a diligent pursuit of him. And it's like, look, there's nothing wrong. It is not sinful to watch a show on Netflix unless it's a sinful show. But like the principle of watching,
most of them are.
well, the principle of watching television is not evil. I remember Pete Scazzero saying like one of the principles that God had to really break out of him was like, it's okay to watch TV. But I just said, I remember David Wilkinson, who's the founder of Times Square Church. He said he used to watch 2 hours of TV a night, and God said to him, give me that 2 hours and I'll use you significantly. And I walked past Times Square Church this week, and I just was like, this whole thing was born out of a man who traded 2 hours of TV for 2 hours of prayer. And so I'm looking to sort of like enter into the burden of God and join Jesus in the garden. And God, are there any burdens? You're looking for a watchman on the wall, and I want to give my nights to that. So I am I'm very idiosyncratic. I'll often slip out when people are watching TV. And I'll go down the street or into the park or down on the pier, and I'll just ask God, Lord, but here's my list, here's my heart, here's my life. And so to me, that sort of balance of enjoying God and then working with God and then contending for the promises of God, I found to be very, very rich. And it sort of keeps me in balance because, all of us probably have a dominant strain, time with God, working with God, or contending for God. And I think I need all three of those to push my heart in different directions.
Man, it's beautiful. It's beautiful is the right word. It's a beautiful resistance. I mean, what I'm hearing, and, it's interesting, both of us, are different but have a lot of similarities, I think, in our teaching and preaching. And both of us say things that you're, quote, not allowed to say in our cities, that directly contradict the secular ideologies that we swim in. But I think if you were to come and visit Bridgetown or Church of the City, it's not a tone or a spirit of anger or us versus them, right? You know what I mean? Talk to us about what kind of culture is born out of this kind of a life that you're putting language to.
Yeah, I was thinking this morning, to follow Jesus well is to carry contradictory things in your heart at all times. And if either one of them wins, you sort of corrupt your witness. And so I was thinking about this. I was like, it's weeping for the brokenness of the world, and it's delighting in the glory of the world at the same time.
Yes.
So
well
like
said.
I'm walking through New York, and I see some of the most beautiful art. It's done by secular people, and my heart's just drawn into glorifying God. And then I take 2 steps later. I saw this on Sunday. I saw someone shoot up heroin. And I'm like, oh, here is this image bearer who should be the most glorious artwork of God, absolutely dominated, shooting heroin in broad daylight. And so it's to both celebrate and weep at the same time. It's to carry that in your heart. It is a profound sense of anger and a profound sense of hope. You're dealing with all of these contradictions. So if all you are is like enjoying the world and you're not weeping for the world, it's like you are tone deaf to the human condition. But if all you are is weeping, it's like you're blind to where God is actually breaking in and the goodness that's inherent in everything. So it's learning to carry both of these things. And I would say for the most part, the default state today is tending towards the broken side of things. And spending that much time in brokenness and depravity and heartache and injustice can sour the heart in profound ways.
It can deform you. Yep.
Yes.
Into a angry, negative, critical person.
I had dinner with Gary Haugen once, who's the founder of IJM. And you know the thing that just struck me the most? How joy-filled he was.
Well, and he sees basically the darkest dark spot on the underbelly of the world, working with, sex trafficking for the most part.
Yeah, and I just was like, you are very different than I thought. And he said, if you do not learn to laugh, you will go insane. He's like, you have to acknowledge both sides of this thing. So yeah, I'm understanding secularism. A lot of folks, and this does require just a touch of pre-knowledge, but it's like a lot of people think that we're in what Charles Taylor calls secularism 2, which means like there's a war for the removal of God from public life. And I'm like, we lost that war. I'm not a culture warrior. I live in a different vision of reality, which says it's my job to make Jesus beautiful again in the midst of the brokenness of secularism. So I'm more of an artist than I am a culture warrior, and I think there's nothing less appealing to this generation than self-preservation and fear. And so much of religious language is about preserving our rights and fear of what's coming. And I do not want to have a spirit that buys into that. I want to, Jesus is my peace I give you. I want to move through the world with the peace of Christ. And that lets me weep at sometimes and it lets me celebrate with others, but it's just a different operating system. So how do you, cultivating that I think is very, very important.
And don't you think there's more of an opening right now than people realize? Like in a, and again, this does require some knowledge of Charles Taylor. In a secularism 2 moment, it's about fighting for, to keep God and Christian values at the center of our society. And I agree with you. I think we're far past that. We're very much into secularism 3. And so the difference there is it's not that Christianity is failing in the West. It's that all of the other narratives in the West are failing too. The progressive narratives are failing. The right-wing narratives are failing. Capitalism is failing. Like individualism is failing. The redefinition of marriage, family, and gender is failing. And it's creating massive anxiety, fear, outrage. People are freaking out. And there's an extraordinary moment right now where, I love your analogy of we're called to be artists. And we don't have to make Jesus beautiful. We just have to uncover the things that have stood between him and a true perception of his beauty. So I think there's an incredible opening right now. What do you see for the future of the church when you look forward, and chart a path? What do you see moving forward for the church?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I just spent a couple of hours last week. Like I tried to go back 25 years and just say, what are all the things that have shaped my journey with God? You know, going back to Pentecostal revivalism in Australia, where the great move of God's around the corner and then it never came. And then moving into sort of the Bill Hybels prevailing church model, which was like literally compelling relief from the anxiety of revival not coming. It was a steady taking of ground, an Acts 2 church, into sort of like a hyper-doctrinal overreaction, so like 5-point Calvinism plus, into sort of like Rick Warren's, which is like, okay, no, people actually need practical tools. And then, no, that's not it, into the emerging church. Then out of the emerging church, into the missional movement. And I just like mapped all the things that have happened. And again, this is predominantly—
And this is like all before you were 25.
No, 28. This is white evangelicalism, granted. But then I just started to think, like, what is the next 25 years of the church going to be? And it was like, I've got a lot of friends having babies right now, and I'm looking at their children and I'm thinking, when I'm in my 60s, what will I have led and stewarded that enables these current babies to grow up in a thing where they say Jesus is better than anything else in this world? And so, you know, I try to spend some time like, what are the fates that they will have to contend with, which are like just way bigger than me and I'll never have any influence over? And then what is this tiny, potent counterculture that we can shape that will help them prepare for these things? So I think the future of the church, it's honestly, it's some things I don't like. There's some things that are the future of the church that I don't like, that are absolutely culturally inevitable. There's some things for the church I'm actually very, very optimistic about. And it's primarily because like people, a lot of folks deconstructing their faith right now. Wait till you deconstruct secularism. You want to talk about a journey of disillusionment into darkness and meaninglessness. You know, it's nihilism. It's nihilism. It's awful.
Nietzsche was right. And you go down that rabbit trail and it is a dark place.
Yeah, people forget. I mean, you know, I remember at the Art of Teaching, you did like a biopsy on Foucault. We forget Nietzsche ended his life like mentally insane, like literally out of his mind. And so, yeah, I think the future of the church is discipleship. The future of the church is discipleship. It is that cultural Christianity around here will literally melt away. It'll just be, it's gone in a lot of places. It will only further disappear. It'll be conscious choices to follow Jesus. I think it'll be genuinely deep formation, people really wanting to become like Jesus because of the darkness of the world. I think it will be explicitly Christ-like, not generically Christian. There will be a re-emphasis on the person of Jesus and the kingdom of Jesus as the only hope. I think a lot of it's going to take place not even on our phones. It's going to take place in AI glasses. You know, whatever. There will 100% be an augmented reality discipleship movement for good or for bad. And we should probably think about a world that is like literally geo-mapped. And is there anything redemptive we can do towards that? And I think we're going to start seeing like two things at once. Discipleship will be better locally than it's been in decades and more digital than it's ever been in decades. It'll be local and online. It will be formation and mission. It will be all of these dichotomies held together in a compelling way. That's what I think. That's where I think it's going. And I think it's going to get hard before it gets better. I think we're moving into a time of further decline before we turn a corner.
So talk to us about, I know there's a Barna study on the future of the church that impacted you and gave shape to some of what you're doing with your most recent book, The Intentional Father and The Primal Path. So let's kind of end the last 10 minutes of our conversation kind of not in a new direction, but like an unexpected ending. How has some of that Barna research given shape to your most recent book and a lot of your thought about parenting?
Well, I was having a conversation with David Kinnaman, who's the president of Barna, just a wonderful guy. And he just had a little throwaway. We were talking about raising our sons. He's got a son a little bit younger than my son. But he did a throwaway comment.
And for those listening, David Barna had a Barna, which is like a Christian think tank, and they do research. They do like wide-scale studies on statistics.
Yeah, that's right. It's data, not opinion, a lot of times.
Yes.
So he basically said, well, I think basically when you look at the data, we've reached the point of irreversible decline in the American church. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, bar and move of God. And he calls them resilient disciples. He wrote a book about discipleship in exile. He said, basically like radical youth discipleship and a move of God, it's over. Like you can't turn it around by any natural means. And I remember just thinking like, oh gosh, Lord, I'll be faithful to you at any time of history and any place by your grace. But all I want to do is to manage the slow decline of the American
It's like,
church.
we were born at the wrong time in history. Holy cow.
I was like, I don't want to do that. And so it gave me this vision of like, I want to work for spiritual renewal. And a huge part of that is the radical discipleship of young people. And then I went back and started to ask the question, like we all know these statistics. It's approximately 70% of kids walk away from their faith when they hit college. It's like if you had any other group doing so poorly, you would say to them, you guys need to change this up. Are you guys aware this isn't working?
Yes. That's not like tweak the system. That's like throw the system in the garbage and find a new one.
Yeah. And I was like, and so I had spent, almost a decade being a youth pastor, and I worked in small rural churches in Texas, and I worked in large suburban mega churches. And I just realized like our way of forming young people like is non-existent. It's non-existent. It is. And I think in many ways it's only gotten worse. And so when I was a dad, I still am a dad, but like, I was like, I've got to do something better. Like, so I'll give you an example. Like, how does the typical kid grow up today? It's like they're like massively dropped into a travel sports system that basically lets them know performing on a field at an adolescent level is more important than stable roots, Christian faith, church attendance. This is the most important thing in our family. We'll reorient all of our schedules around this. So that what I just said is controversial, offends people. Number two, kids are given a cell phone and they're exposed to like the darkness of all of humanity on the internet. All the stuff that's just come out, which we all knew, but is now confirmed about like how it's like social media is toxic for teenagers. It's toxic. The pornification of young brains, young men basically marinating their brains in violent pornography.
At their most like neuroplastic,
yes.
their most malleable age of their entire life.
For like a decade of that. And you just go like, the occasional youth retreat with a cool altar call and some fun games is not going to undo that. So when I was a youth pastor, I kept bumping into these kids who were different than all the kids that I was leading. And I found out they were all Mormons.
Yes.
And I went to the Mormons and like literally called up the local Mormon local church, and was like, hey, can I talk to someone about like how you disciple your young people? And so I went out and hung out with one of the leaders, and he told me about how like, the young men are given this priesthood. They like literally receive a mantle of spiritual authority, and then all of the kids go through seminary. So in high school, for an hour a day before school, they read the Old Testament 1 year, the New Testament, then Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, and then the Book of Mormon the senior year. And then they do a missionary training thing, and they're sent on a mission for 2 years. And then they're welcomed back into the community. And I was like, oh gosh, we don't do that.
Yeah.
And like the dropout rates of Mormonism are not as high as the dropout rates of evangelicals. In fact, every day, the equivalent of one Southern Baptist church, 280 something people convert to Mormonism in the United States. It's like it's the fastest growing religion in America right now. That they just have a vision of forming their young people. And it made me go, I've got to. And then upon some measure of reflection, I look back and, I pastored the last youth group, or the last ministry I led had over 1,000 people, and it was large. And I look today, almost 15 years later, at who's walking with God. And honestly, it was the people who came from strong families or who were discipled. Like a lot of the crowd's just not around. Wow. So I basically said, we got to reclaim this. We've got to come up with some sort of formation process. And that's basically what launched me into writing my book.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, first off, I had a very similar experience. I remember when I was in high school, I switched high school right before my senior year, which I do not recommend. And I went to a new high school because I could graduate in half the time. It's a long story. And, I've spent my whole life on the West Coast, grew up in the Bay Area, then Portland, very secular environment where there's no other Christians hardly at all around you. And at this new high school, it's like every other person I met was a Christian. This was like back in the late 90s when the WWJD bracelet had just come out. I don't know that it was ever cool, but it was just out. And everybody, I was like, oh my gosh, you're a Christian, you're a Christian, you're a Christian. And then I found out it's because we were like a few blocks from the Mormon temple. And so that was where the Mormon community was located. It was all around this high school. And they literally bought a house across the street from this public high school. And same thing, exactly. I think it was like 6 or 7 a.m. at 1 hour every single morning. All of these Mormon kids would go to this house, study scripture, study the Book of Mormon, and the level of formation, how seriously they took formation, it was just at another level I had no prior experience of. And I remember thinking, whatever we do with our kids has to be that strong or stronger, So talk to us about what the primal path is, where that came from. This is something you've done with your son. I am just about through with my firstborn son, and my sons are 3 years apart and 6 days apart by their birthday. So I get 6 days off, and then I start round true with my second boy. So right now I'm plotting our road trip down Highway 1 for an 8-day kind of beginning to the whole thing, and the fire in the forest. Talk to us about what you're doing with your son at a discipleship level, the genius behind it, and kind of what your most recent book, which I think is your best book, The Intentional Father. I don't know what percentage of listeners are fathers. I don't know if it's 10%, 20%, but I just want to take a few minutes for you to put language to what it is that you're doing.
Yeah, well, there's a Jungian psychologist, Anthony Stevens, and he says, basically, although our culture has allowed these ideas of rites and passage of formation, particularly for young men, to disappear, there's still some archetypal need within us to be initiated. And so, Rolheiser says you look at what's happening with young people today, and we go back to ancient societies and we look at how they formed young people. And some of them would even die during the ordeal component of the initiation. And he says that's so barbaric, but he says, look how many kids today are committing suicide, getting pregnant, living with radical rates of depression because nobody's initiating them into adulthood. He says there's something needed for an older generation to walk.
Or adolescents attempt to self-initiate through drugs or drunk driving or jumping off bridges or getting people pregnant or crazy stuff.
They're literally saying, my body is filled with these chemicals. I'm hitting puberty. I'm wanting to get outside of myself and experience reality. It's an attempt at self-actualization. And they're basically saying, someone guide me with these energies. It's very confusing to be a young person. And so if you don't have somebody who helps you channel those confusing energies, you're just going to go all over the map trying to make sense of them. Most societies, and so there's one absolutely a fascinating man who studied 18 languages, and he lived at a time of history. This is Van Gellop, when colonization, unfortunately, was at its prime. And so they were basically exploring the world and sending in reports of indigenous peoples. He learned 18 languages, and he came back and he realized that all societies basically have a 6-step process of forming young people into adulthood, and we don't have any of it. So here's basically what he says. Number one is separation, where young people are consciously taken away from their stable childhood community into a different reality. Number two, they're initiated, so they cross some sort of threshold and enter into a journey. Then they're formed. There's a process of formation that happens in 3 areas. They're formed into the story of their community, so they're not selfish. The religion of their community, so they have a sense of reverence, and the roles their gender requires of them to be helpful to their community. This goes on for some time. Then they're taken through what is called the ordeal. And the ordeal is where the young person has to go out on their own to test whether or not they have internalized and actualized all the things that they've learned over the years. So in Australia, the Aboriginals would do this thing for young men called literally walkabout, where they would sometimes for up to 6 months be out in the 100-degree heat, where, by the way, everything in Australia is trying to kill you. 6 months on their own in the wilderness, surviving to prove they had what it takes.
It's like the opposite of helicopter parenting.
Yes. Inuit would have to go out and hunt, and the young men would have to kill a caribou or a sea lion to prove they actually had it. The Maasai killed the lion. Native Americans had the vision quest. Today, the Dutch is one of the last communities where they still do this. They call this dropping, where they literally drop teenagers in the middle of the woods and they have to find their way out. But they basically had to test, do I have what it takes? If they did, when they returned from the ordeal, they were recognized by the community and that they were reintegrated in. You mentioned helicopter parenting. They did research at New York University to ask the question, when did helicopter parenting begin? And they came back and they found on a sort of a generational map, it was the year 1990. And within one generation, rates of depression and anxiety raised by 80% after the birth of helicopter parenting. Because there's some psychological need for young people to be formed and to test themselves in the world. And when that is repressed and not extended, they are overwhelmed. And so what I was basically trying to do was like say to the Christian church, here's how to reclaim that pathway in the way of Jesus. Here's how to take this universal understanding about how to form our young people and then put it through the lens of the way of Jesus and reinstitute it. So I took my son on a journey, starting when he was 13. He ran into the water off the coast of New York as an initiation ceremony. And when he was 19, after a whole series of formational experiences and curriculum and learning and mentoring, after a gap year and hiking the Camino de Santiago, which is a 500-mile walk across Spain, he ran into the ocean in a town called Finisterre and was welcomed back into the community of men as a recognized member. And so I basically tried to take the best of sort of like developmental psychology, Christian discipleship, and merge it together into a pathway. And let me be honest with you, I was actually staggered that this didn't exist. Now, there's like some noble books, but they were like formation light, like do a camping trip and have a sex talk. And I'm like, yeah, but what do you do with the other, 1,000 days you have with your kid? Like you got to have something that is designed to do this. So I was looking around and I was like, why doesn't this exist? And so I tried to like put something in that was like a holistic pathway. And I got something different for my daughter because she's a little bit different. But that was the vision. Like, how do we create a formation pathway to produce godly men, not toxic men, and basically help produce resilient disciples in the midst of secularism? So that's basically what the book's about. It's a practical book on how to do it.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And it's been the template that I've used thanks to you. So thank you for pioneering a path for a new path or an ancient path for a lot of us. This is applicable to fathers and mothers and families and the youth pastors and the church as a whole, but especially to fathers. And again, I don't know if that's 10% of the people listening or what, but you've just recently started a great podcast with Jeff Bethke called The Intentional Family, which was a bit hilarious because you and I released our new podcast on the same day, unbeknownst to either of each other. So I'm sorry. Hope I didn't contradict that in any way. But I just got to listen to your first couple of episodes on my run, and it was just such a delight. And I was just like, like the worst part about listening to podcasts when you're running is you can't take notes,
Yeah,
and so I find myself like, hey, Siri, and I'll keep telling Siri to write things down so I don't forget them as I'm running. But you had an interesting line at the beginning. You said, quote, I honestly believe one of the enemy's great strategies is to destroy fathers. Maybe as we think about, your work on fatherhood, my work on the enemy, talk to us a little bit about what's behind that quote.
Well, I mean, it's from multiple. Part of it is theological. God is revealed as our great Father, our Father. And when you think about the archetype of what a father is supposed to do, he's supposed to bless you. He's supposed to provide for you, to protect you, to create a sense of like being wanted, psychological safety. And if you remove that reference point in your life, all you do is create a society of unblessed people striving for approval and competing with one another. There's no divine reference point of acceptance and love and unconditional care. And so, number one, destroying the theological reality of who God is has a profound impact on our world today. I think it shows up sociologically. I mean, kids raised without fathers, it is heartbreaking, but they are at a cultural disadvantage. More likely to go to prison, more likely to drop out of high school, more likely to be, to get pregnant before marriage. more likely to commit acts of violence, spousal abuse. The list just goes on and on and on, because we are designed for like an archetypal, primal, loving blessing. It's woven into the grain of the universe, and we struggle without it. So I think the enemy's plan is to like get rid of our vision of God, get rid of our vision of life and blessing from him, produce a competitive, insecure society filled with anxiety that competes with one another. And then that manifests itself not just inside the church and theologically, it manifests itself, throughout the world today. And so I think recovering that the stable gift of that is one of the great tasks of our world today. So yeah, wow. It's multidimensional.
There's some profound thought in that. As we end, what would you say? I don't know anybody that got what your son Nate got with the primal path. And I know a lot of people who didn't even get the blessing of a father. What would you say to people who are listening, who are loving and trying to follow Jesus, but who feel that deficit of blessing, that lack of formation and a lot of the deformation of their family of origin or the world itself? Like, what would you say in closing?
Well, I mean, I always brought back to the comfort of the Psalms. Psalm 27 is a beautiful psalm. Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me.
Yeah.
And to just literally know that you are received by God. To all who received him, he gave the right to become children of God, not born of a mother or father's will, but born of God. And that is the beauty of our faith. We are chosen, adopted, wanted, welcomed by God. And so we really have to spend time receiving comfort from God. It says, again in the Psalms, he sets the lonely in families. That's so, regardless, he says he leads out the prisoners with singing, regardless of the bondage that we've been in terms of our family systems, we can be led by divine joy into divine community. So we have to really spend time getting healing in our heart and processing that at a deep level. Our deepest wounds, many of our deepest wounds are things that happen in our childhood and in our families of origin. And so you need that like deep sense of renewal and comfort from God. And then I think we need one of the gifts we have being in a part of a church community is that we still have this sense of social fabric and social capital. We're still surrounded by this web of relationships. Though imperfect, we are all oriented towards the same thing. And I think about, in the Gospels, when Peter's kind of freaked out about the rich young ruler, and Jesus says, whoever's left home or father or mother or brothers, I will give them back to him. And he says, and in this life, 100-fold, those things will be given to you. Rely on the church community. That we have natural families of origin, and the church in some sense is like chosen family. It's like we get to construct families and communities of healing around us because of the grace of Jesus. And I would say, I don't want to skim past, hey, the church will fix everything, because often it complicates things. So it's like you've got to spend time receiving the Father's love. Oh, what manner of love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God, and this is what we are. Like you need to sit in the place and marinate that the Father is lavishing love on you. You ever seen a young couple in love and he's just lavishing love? That's God's disposition towards you, a lavishing of love. So we've got to receive that. We've got to live in that. That's what I'm trying to do in the mornings, in my morning time. I'm receiving the Father's love. In many ways, it's hard for my personality. I'm letting God love me and loving him in return. There's a deep daily work of accessing and living out of the love of God. And then I'm leaning into Christian community. I'm not advocating in this book that it's one heroic dad doing all the work. I'm actually advocating for cohorts of dads and communities of dads and the Christian tribe and community rallying around our sons and daughters to help raise them up. And I believe because of the breakdown of society and all of the normal ways that we used to have community, we are at a tremendous advantage. This is a gift we can invite the world into. So receive the Father's love, lean into the Christian community, and anticipate eternity. Let the Spirit groan within you. Let the Abba cry rise, Abba, Father. Pay attention to it and respond to it.
Wow. Thank you, Jon. I mean, gosh, there's so much wisdom in what you just said. I feel like I am thinking right now, I need to go back and listen to this podcast next week when it comes out. And so thank you for being with us. We've been talking about Jon's two most recent books. He has a few others, but Beautiful Resistance, and then most recently, The Intentional Father. I can't recommend them enough. They are both just phenomenal. Jon, thank you for your heart. Thank you for saying yes to God's wiring of you and how God made you and what God's put you on the earth to do and in New York to do and on the internet to do. So thank you so much. Where can people find more about you, your work, follow along with what you're up to?
I think I've just got, I probably need to get a website at some point soon, but right now it's just on social media, Jon Tyson, JonTyson, and our church is church.nyc.
Beautiful. Thank you for being with us.
Mate, what a joy. So good to chat.
Thanks so much for listening to today's conversation. If you want to go deeper, this is just scratching the surface. Feel free to pick up a copy of my new book, Live No Lies, available wherever books are sold. There's a link in the video notes. Also, make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel to just stay up to date on new material coming from me with this podcast and more in the future. And finally, I just want to say thank you. This entire podcast and video series was brought to you by our partners at World Vision, who are doing great work all around the world, in particular with the most vulnerable, but have just started to kind of move into the arena of caring for pastors. Pastors are, just facing a lot in the last year or two, in particular with a global pandemic, but so much more. A lot are feeling beat up and burned out. And World Vision partnered with Danielle Strickland, who's a friend of mine and a great teacher and writer and thinker, to put together a new resource called Soul Care Prayer Rhythms, which is kind of an intro to how do you keep your body and your soul alive in a time like the one we're living into. You can follow the link in the video notes for more information to access this resource for yourself. And again, thank you so much to our partners at World Vision who made this possible. All right, have a wonderful day and peace to you all.